So last week was a really exciting week. We started John chapter 18 with the trial of Pilate and Jesus, right? Now we often think of it as Jesus standing before Pilate, but really it's ultimately Pilate standing before Jesus because Pilate is the one who's really on display. What is he going to do with truth is the main question. Is he going to live it out on the outside? The truth that he experiences on the inside, and that's John chapter 18. And the trial itself goes from chapter 18, verse 28, and continues on all the way through chapter 19, verse 17 or verse 16. And so that's where the trial of Pilate before Jesus takes place. And it's really a kind of a cool way that John does this. Now, I'm sure John is just recording the facts, but the way that he does it shows a theological point, right? Like he's showing how Pilate is forced to go outside because the Jews will not go inside. They're too afraid of becoming unclean by stepping into the residence of a Gentile. So Pilate is forced to go outside, and on the outside, he's asked to judge Jesus. And then he goes inside, and when he's inside, he gets to experience the person of Jesus. Who is he? What does he come to do? And Jesus claims about himself that he is somebody who testifies to truth. Pilate asks him, are you really a king? And Jesus asks him, well, is that your idea of a king, or is it somebody tell you about that, right? So often we think of Jesus being the other people's ideas of what a king is. It's definitely, he's not a king in the way that the Jews might have anticipated Jesus to be a king, right? His kingdom is not a kingdom that the Jews would have anticipated. No, Jesus doesn't claim to be a king in that text, but he talks about his kingdom. His kingdom is from another place, right? It's not of this world. And right in between that, you get a sentence of what the subjects are doing. See, if the kingdom was focused on this world and trying to oppose the world authorities, then, well, it'd be fighting for Jesus, right? They would be fighting to stop his arrest right now. But instead, like the king, the subjects of the kingdom should be focused on truth, the truth of who God is, right? And what is truth, as Pilate says. And if you've been reading the book of John or following along with us, you know what truth is because John has made it very clear, right? Truth is personified in Jesus. He's the representation, the revelation of who God is. When you look at Jesus, you see the truth of God, right? Jesus says he is the way, the truth, and the life, right? No one comes to the Father but by him. So we know the answer to Pilate's question, what is truth? The question is, does Pilate know, now that he's experienced truth, how he's going to live it out on the outside? See, he's experienced truth on the inside. Now he's got to go back outside to meet with the Jews. And how is that truth going to impact his conversation with the Jews? How's it going to impact his time where he's got to be out in the world? Now, Pilate testifies to truth. He says, I find no fault in this man, right? As opposed to saying he doesn't know, he says what he does know. He testifies to truth. But he's not willing to allow truth to dictate his actions because he's not ruled by truth. He's ruled by self-care and wanting to be, he's ruled by wanting to keep his place in authority. And so instead of just letting Jesus go free because he finds no fault in him, instead, Pilate begins to compromise with truth. And he says something like, do you want me to let go of the king of the Jews? Would you like me to set him free? But instead, the people choose Barabbas. This is the kind of person the world often picks, right? This Barabbas. He's in jail because he started an insurrection, or he was part of an uprising, as John says. See, the world looks for those types of leaders so often, right? Not the kind of king that Jesus has come to be, but the one that's out to fight. And Jesus brings about this kingdom of peace. But anyway, we see Barabbas as he's let go, as he's allowed to go free, and Jesus is condemned. We know that Barabbas is the one who's actually guilty, and Jesus is the one that's actually innocent. And for that, Barabbas becomes this stand-in for every Christian today, right? You are all Barabbases. I'm looking at you all, and I see a bunch of Barabbases in the audience. You deserved the punishment that Jesus endured, right? And so maybe you should take a second just to say thank you, Jesus, right? Because we are experiencing the freedom that we have in Christ because he endured the penalty that we deserved. See, the world wants Barabbas. Barabbas is allowed to go free. But then, right in the center of this trial, and I think John puts it in the center of this trial on purpose because it's really the jewel right in the center of the trial, we see a parody of the coronation service of Jesus. And I want you to look at it with me in chapter 19, starting in verse 1. You're going to see this parody of a coronation service. It says, "Then Pilate took Jesus, and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe, and they went up to him and again saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews.' And they slapped him on the face." That's where we ended last week, right? So I just recapped everything I told you last week, and now we're on something new, right? That's where we ended. You have this coronation service of Jesus being beaten and flogged and a crown of thorns pressed into his head and a purple robe put around his wounds, and then they slap him as they say, "Hail, King of the Jews." Now that's really important because Pilate himself has claimed twice that Jesus is king. Well, at least he asks him, "Are you a king?" That's the first question. And then when he brings him out in front of the crowd, the Jews, the first time, he says, "Would you like me to free the King of the Jews?" See, a lot of times John will use somebody who is an adversary to speak a great truth. Like that's how John goes about writing his gospel. These people that typically will oppose speak great truths. For instance, Pilate saying, "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" Well, he's speaking a truth. He doesn't realize it. He might be trying to be sarcastic, but he is speaking a truth. Jesus is the King of the Jews. But I'm going to give you a couple other times that this happens. In John chapter 11, verse 49, we see the Jews, they're looking for a way to have Jesus put to death. And what happens there is they realize that, well, it's not working. And they look for ways to kill him. But listen to what Caiaphas, he's the high priest at this moment. In verse 49, it says, "Then one of them named Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, spoke up. And he says, 'You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it's better for you that one man die for the people than the whole nation to perish.'" Right? Now, the reason I bring this up is because that's how John has kind of pointed out things in his gospel. He's used people who are opposed to say a great truth. This is obviously true, right? Like Jesus is the one man who's going to die for the nation. So although he's speaking it in ignorance, he doesn't realize the true effect of what he's saying. He's saying a great truth. It's not the only time this happens. It happens again in John chapter 12, where now the Pharisees are going to say something that's really a great truth. In John chapter 12, verse 19, it says, "So the Pharisees said to one another, 'See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world is going after him.'" Like that's going to be descriptive of what happens after he dies, right? When he's lifted up, he's going to draw all men to himself. But do you notice how John uses somebody who opposes Jesus to speak the truth? Well, it happens again in John chapter 19 when the soldiers are the one who are beating him and slapping him. And what are they saying to him? "Hail, King of the Jews." See, they're saying that in ignorance, but it's the great truth that we all know, right? This Jesus who's you've crucified, right? This Jesus who's been crucified is both Lord and Christ. See, we know the truth of who Jesus is. He's the King of the Jews. The soldiers don't understand what they're saying, but we do. We can see the truth in that. See, I think as we consider Jesus and his trial, or Pilate as he stands before Jesus, one of the things that is a driving theme in the whole event is that Jesus is truly king. That's going to be a main theme. And so now, based on that truth, we all have it, right? What are you going to do with it? Pilate has to go back outside, and that's going to lead me to my next point. Remember, we're on the flip side now of the trial of Jesus. And my next point, which is actually the fifth scene, but my first point says, outside, the Jews shout for crucifixion, or shout crucify. See, that's what happens next. In verse 4, it says, "Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, 'Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him.' When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to him, 'Here is the man.' As soon as the chief priests and the officials saw him, they shouted out, 'Crucify, crucify. But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for the charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." See, now for the first time, you start to see that the Jews are pronouncing the method in which they want Jesus to be put to death. They want him to be humiliated. They want him to be crucified. It wasn't enough that he was already flogged. It wasn't enough that he was already beaten. They want him to be crucified, cursed, if you will, right? Because Deuteronomy tells us that whoever's hung on a pole is cursed. And yet the Messiah, the one that they had hoped for, is now the one that the Jewish people are going to curse, right? To reject. And that's such an important point. I think that we have to really hold on to it. The Messiah that they anticipated is the one that they're going to curse. But moving past just the fact that they want him crucified, you should note that once again, Jesus is here presented as a king. See, that's what Pilate says. He says, "Here is your man." And he stands in front of the Jews, the hope of Israel, and he's dressed like, well, a parody of a king. Do you find it interesting, at least, that John continues to tell us that at this point he's still clothed in the purple robe and he still has the crown of thorns on his head? Like he's brought out before the nation of Israel to say, here is the man that you've been waiting for, the man that your hope should have been in. And yet, as opposed to acceptance of the light, they would rather choose darkness instead, right? That's the Jews, I guess, that are surrounding this. It's rather than accepting the light, they rather choose darkness. But for the first time now, you also get to see what are they really upset about. See, they would have accepted Jesus had he been the king that they anticipated. In fact, John tells us they wanted to make him king by force, right? But that's not what they were upset with Jesus about. What they were upset with Jesus about is blasphemy. That Jesus claimed that he was the Son of God. In fact, that's what they say. They tell him, we have a law, and according to the law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. That was their real problem with Jesus. Maybe you might remember in chapter 5, there was a story of Jesus, and he had healed the man who was paralyzed, a paralytic. He had been paralyzed or in that condition for 38 years, right? And he had given up on life. I mean, when he talks to Jesus, he says, every time the water is stirred, there was a belief that when the water is stirred, if you could get to the water, you would be set free from whatever infirmity that you had. There was a belief that if he could just get down there first, he would be set free, right? But he had given up on that. And he tells Jesus, every time the water is stirred, people get ahead of me. I can't make it down there in time. And so what's the point of even trying? That's why Jesus asked, do you really want to get well? Right? And then when he heals him, he says, take up your mat and walk. Now, all the Pharisees and teachers of the law, they were all so angry about this. But why were they so angry? They were angry because Jesus had healed somebody on the Sabbath. And what Jesus said about that is that my Father is working and at work to this very day. And if my Father is working, the Son must be working too. And it's at that moment they decided they wanted to have him put to death. They wanted to kill him. They began to persecute him, is what John says, because he claimed, a mere man claimed to be God's Son, right? Now that would be something that would be blasphemy if he didn't back up his claim. But Jesus was able to back up his claim. The man is walking, right? And so just as the Jews believed that God was at work giving life and making judgments, so the Son of God in Jesus Christ is giving life and making judgments. You see that all in the story. But being the Son of God is something that Jesus claimed. And the claim is proved when he does the miracle that gives it credit. And so even in that moment, you see these Jewish people beginning to want to persecute him, want to put him to death because he claimed to be the Son of God. But truly he was the Son of God. I want you to see that in verse 8 it says, Pilate heard this and he was even more afraid. Like that's the kind of stuff that made Pilate afraid because it worked within his belief system. The Romans had a pantheon of gods and it was no big thing for a god to come and walk among them. In fact, if you remember in the book of Acts, there's stories of Paul and Barnabas as they show up into a town and everybody wants to claim them to be a god, right? So like it happens. Pilate becomes more afraid because if this is really the Son of God, well, now he's in a different realm. He's in something more than he's used to. He becomes afraid. But I think his fear is something that we have to consider as we consider, is Jesus really who he claims to be? That's what John is beginning to ask us. And so Pilate is even more afraid. In verse 9, he says he went back inside the palace, which brings me to my second point. My second point is that inside, Jesus explains to Pilate what true power is. He explains to Pilate true power. And let's look at it. Verse 9, it says, and when he went back inside the palace, he said, where did you come from? He asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Do you not realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? And Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. Right? You notice Pilate is really afraid. He's fearing, where do you come from? And that question, where do you come from, has more to do than like, what region were you born in? Maybe that's the question I should have asked tonight. Like, where did you come from? Right? Like, and we'd hear all about your different locations of where you're coming from, or in Craig's case, where he's going back to visit. Right? But this question that Pilate asks Jesus is more than like, what region are you from? This question has to do with the accusation made against him. Is Jesus really a son of God? Right? That's the question. And Jesus won't answer him. Now, I think as we consider Jesus and his response, in fact, the Synoptic Gospels kind of make this to be more of what Jesus says when he's in the trial with Pilate. He keeps his mouth closed more. In John, he talks a little bit less, but he doesn't answer him. He doesn't respond to his question. And of course, people in power, that makes them mad, right? Like, I'm the one who's in authority here. You should answer my question. That's how Pilate thinks. Don't you realize that I have the power to crucify you or to let you live? Now, I've kind of pointed this out. This power that Pilate believes that he has is really kind of a fake power. He's a pawn in a bigger game, right? Pilate has a claim to power, but already he's shown that if he had the power to let Jesus free, he would have done it in the first place, but instead he tries to compromise, right? If he had true power, he would have let him free at the very beginning of the trial. And then after trying to compromise, he tries to appease the people. Maybe if I just have Jesus beaten and flogged and punished severely, maybe then they'll let him free. But you notice again that you can't compromise with truth. You can't appease the crowd. Like, you have to live according to the truth. And if Pilate was truly a man of integrity, truly a man of power, he could have let Jesus go at any one of these points. But again, he doesn't. And now he's back in the inner room with him, discussing with Jesus what is true power, right? Jesus tells him something that I think is fairly important. But I guess before I want to get there, I want to talk about Jesus being the answer to Pilate's question, where did you come from? Because I skipped over it. In John chapter 16, we get the answer of where did Jesus come from. In John 16, verse 27, he says this, no, the Father himself loves you because you have loved me and have believed that I came from God. So what's the answer to where Jesus came from? He comes from God, right? Verse 28, I came from the Father and entered into the world. Now I am leaving the world and going back to the Father. See, that's where Jesus comes from. And where is he going? But you notice that there's this beginning phrase to that. The reason the Father loves you is because you believed me. Right? The reason, let me read it again. No, the Father himself loves you because you have loved me and have believed that I came from God. See, this belief in the incarnation of Jesus is something that's essential to what we believe as Christians, right? We don't believe that it was a mere man that stood before Pilate. We don't believe that it was a mere man that explained to Pilate the nature of the kingdom. We don't believe that it was a mere man that that was beaten with the flogging, or that had the thorns pressed into his forehead, or had the purple robe placed on his back. We don't believe it was just an ordinary person. We believe that this person is the God incarnate. We believe that he came from God, and that this act is that he's going back to God. I think that's why the incarnation is so important, because, well, Jesus is a son of God. And Pilate believes that he has authority, but truly he doesn't have any power. Jesus tells him about power. He says, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." That's Jesus' statement about power. You think you're in power, but really you're just a pawn in all of this, right? God is the one who ultimately has power. And I want to read this verse from John chapter 3, verse 31, because Jesus is talking there about power as well. And I believe it's fairly important to what he's saying about power. And John chapter 3, verse 31, it says this: "The one who comes from above is above all. The one who is from the earth belongs to the earth, and speaks as one from the earth. The one who comes from heaven is above all." Do you notice again, like right there, there's this beginning statement, ending statement. The one that comes from heaven is above all. He's above everything. Even Pilate. And Jesus himself is claiming to be the Son of God, the one that comes from the Father. He's the one that comes from above and is above all. And because he's above all, well, he's even the one that's ultimately in power, even inside the room that Pilate is standing before him. Because he comes from above and he's above all. Pilate only has the power that was given to him from above. And that makes us wonder, like, well, who's really responsible for the cross? See, because Jesus says to Pilate, there is someone who's guilty of even a greater sin. The one who handed me over to you is the one who is guilty of the greater sin. A lot of people want to put Judas there. He's like the one who betrayed Jesus. But I think the context kind of points out the fact that it's the Jews are the ones that handed him over. The people of Israel, the ones that handed him over to Pilate to be crucified. And they're the ones that are guilty of the greater sin. Now, just because they're guilty of the greater sin doesn't mean there's no sin involved for Pilate, by the way. There's still some, right? He just doesn't have the lion's share of it. I think now we can probably see the irony in the beginning scene where we saw the Jews who refused to come inside because they were so worried about becoming unclean by coming in contact with a Gentile. Yet in their fear of becoming physically unclean, they were committing the greatest sin of all. They were handing the Son of God, the one who's truly in power because he comes from above, they were handing him over to the Pilate to be crucified. That's why Jesus says they're guilty of even a greater sin. But Pilate has some blame in this too. If he really was a man that was principled, he would have lived according to truth. But instead, he's ruled by a fear of maybe losing his position of power. He wants to stay in that position, so he compromises. He tries to appease. He's not really guilt-free. If he wanted to be guilt-free, he would have lived according to the truth that he knew. No matter how Pilate tries to get out of it, no matter how many times he might wash his hands and say, I take no responsibility, there is some responsibility that has to be placed at the feet of Pilate. So the Jews are definitely guilty of a greater sin, but Pilate is guilty of sin, and I guess you guys are guilty of sin too, right? Because you're Barabbas, as John just said. You guys are the ones that Jesus is taking the penalty that you deserve. He was crushed for our transgressions, right? Pierced for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities. He's taking the penalty that you deserve. So I guess some guilt for the cross at least lies at your feet. And I think we have to, when we're talking about guilt, we have to shift our perspective now and maybe talk about responsibility. And there is some responsibility for the cross that has to be given to God. Look at Acts chapter 2. And this is in this is going to be in verse 22. It says this, fellow Israelites, this is Peter, by the way. It's the day of Pentecost. He's speaking before. And he's not doing it alone. He's got all the disciples, all 11 of them, standing behind them as witnesses to everything Jesus did and taught, all the way up to the resurrection. This is the one point in Acts that you see all the disciples of Jesus united with one message. It's the first gospel message. And Peter stands up amongst them and he says this, fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which he did among you through him. As you yourself know, this man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. So there's some responsibility, although it's harder to get our head around. I'm not saying guilt, but God is responsible for the cross too. It was by his plan and foreknowledge. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. We're not talking guilt, we're talking about responsibility, because God in his sovereignty turned his Son over to people like Pilate. See, he would have no power unless it came down to him from above. And God put him in this position for just this moment, so that his plans could be accomplished, so that you can have freedom in Christ, right? Because God so loved the world that he did that. I think when we think about the responsibility for the cross, there's definitely guilt that lays at our feet. There's guilt that lays at Pilate's feet. There's guilt that lays at the feet of the Jews. But there's some of the responsibility goes to God himself, who handed Jesus over. And then, of course, we have to remember, as we were reminded this morning, that the Good Shepherd lays his own life down. Jesus willingly went to the cross. I guess that's what makes this such an amazing moment is the person that we're talking about comes from above. He is the Son of God, and he's willingly handing himself over. Anyways, I guess I shouldn't breathe so loud. My next point is outside. Pilate goes back outside. This is going to end the trial. And he agrees to condemn Jesus. Let's look at it. It's in verse 12 of John chapter 19. It says this. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jewish leaders kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend to Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. While Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at the place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. Here is your king, Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. That's the end scene of the trial of Jesus. And there's a couple things I really want to key in, and I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to just talk about this one thing. Right? There's so much in here, but just this one thing. And it's that the Jews themselves shouted, we have no king but Caesar. Right? That's such a tragic statement, because as Pilate stands or sits at this point, he's sitting at the judgment seat, and he gives two judgments. He says, shall I crucify your king? Right? And that's the judgment. Jesus is the king. He's going to be handed over to crucified. But also in this moment, the Jews, the people of Israel, are judging themselves. They judge themselves when they say, we have no king but Caesar. Just think about the irony of that statement. The people of Israel who have one time rejected God as their king, and so God gave them a leader. Right? And he told Samuel, don't take it personally. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me as their king. And so God raised up a leader. The first one didn't work out, but the second one in David, right, becomes the king, in which God said, I'm going to establish your throne, and it'll be an everlasting throne, right? Like it's going to continue. Your throne is going to be established. That's the hope of the people of Israel. Well, of course, that doesn't always work out, right? Because the people of Israel have to go into exile. And because they're disobedient, they're taken off to a different country. But they begin to harbor this hope for a future Messiah, a root and from the offspring of David, of Jesse, right? Somebody who's going to spring up and take the place of that promise that God made to his servant David. See, I'm talking about the Messiah. This is the hope of Israel. And they were not people who were supposed to pledge their loyalty to anyone else. In fact, there's a verse in Isaiah. It's Isaiah chapter 26. And I'm going to read it real quick. I didn't mark it, so it's going to take me longer to find it. But in Isaiah 26, actually, I'm just going to turn around and read it. It says, O Lord our God, other lords besides you have ruled over us, but your name alone do we honor. Do you guys notice that? This is the people of Israel as they're in exile, right? They say, look, we know we've had other kings, but we will not honor anyone else except for you, O Lord our God. And yet in this moment, they're saying, we have no king but Caesar. And the Jews are judging themselves. They have just pledged their loyalty, their fidelity to Caesar. And that's such an important key to understanding God's relationship with Israel today. Because God did not reject Israel. God does not replace Israel. Israel rejects God. And God fulfills his promises to Israel in the person of Christ. See, we can see this throughout the whole gospel. John uses signs to kind of point to it. Here he is at the wedding banquet. The very first sign, the bridegroom has showed up to the wedding feast and the bride was not ready. That's pointing to the hope of Israel and the people of Israel not being ready. The second time we see a sign, Jesus says, tear down this temple and in 3 days I will rebuild it. But the temple he's talking about was his body. See, he's come to replace that too. Right? The meeting place with God is now men. You can go on, you can look at the establishment himself. He tells a Pharisee in Nicodemus that obedience to the law doesn't cut it anymore. You must be born again. You need more? John is continuing to drive this drumbeat of God fulfilling his promises to Israel in the person of Christ. You go to Jacob's well. Anybody who continues to drink from this well will continue to be thirsty. But Jesus promises a water that will, if you drink from, you'll never be thirsty again. You can go further to the Sabbath, right? Just as my Father's working on the Sabbath, so I too am working. Jesus becomes the Lord of the Sabbath. He fulfills that one too. The Passover, Jesus is the bread of life. He shows that after he feeds the 5,000. Over and over and over again, John is showing us that Jesus is the fulfillment of the hope of Israel. We could continue, right? I mean, he says that he's the light of the world. Just like the people of Israel followed a fire through the desert. He says that he offers living water, and that rock himself that Moses had struck is Christ. He's the good shepherd who lays his life down. See, we can look at John as he's gone throughout his book, and every time he's shown that Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel's hope. The question is, now that the king is standing before the nation of Israel, and Pilate proclaims to them that he is king, they still reject him and say, we have no king but Caesar. And that's where I think that the people of Israel have a hope today, but it's in the person of Christ. That's where we're at. Because Jesus is the fulfillment of that. As we look at this trial, the last part of it just says, and Pilate turned him over to be crucified. And I think the last person to be judged is Pilate himself. He knows truth. He rejects it. But the question is, what are you doing with the truth of who Jesus is? He's not just a mere man. He is the Son of God. He isn't a victim of the cross. He's victorious over the cross. He lays his own life down only to take it up again.